I'm about to show you why spring allergies in American cities have gotten steadily worse for 50 years, and the answer has almost nothing to do with the weather. It comes down to a single decision made by city planners in the middle of the last century, repeated in thousands of towns, and almost nobody outside horticulture knows it happened. Let me start with the puzzle, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Pollen allergies should logically be worse in the countryside, out where the fields and forests and meadows are, and where there is far more vegetation per square mile than in any city. But the opposite is true, because urban pollen levels frequently run higher than rural ones. And city dwellers report worse seasonal allergies than people living in the farmland surrounding them. That makes no sense at all until you look closely at what is actually growing along an American street. And there is a second part to the puzzle, because pollen counts in this country have been climbing steadily for decades. And the allergy season now starts earlier and lasts longer than it did a generation ago. Most people assume that is nature doing what nature does, or bad luck, or simply that they have become more sensitive with age. A significant part of it was a policy, and that policy was written down and published. And the scale of the problem is worth stating clearly, because it is not a minor inconvenience affecting a handful of people. Roughly a quarter of American adults report a seasonal pollen allergy, which puts the figure in the tens of millions, and the number has been climbing steadily for decades. For most of those people, it means weeks of itching eyes, blocked sinuses, headaches, and broken sleep every spring, along with money spent on medication that only manages the symptoms. For people with asthma, it is considerably more serious, since a heavy pollen day can trigger attacks and send people to emergency rooms, and pollen spikes are measurably associated with increases in hospital visits. So when a landscaping decision affects the pollen load of an entire city, it is not a matter of taste or tidiness, because it is a public health variable that nobody was treating as one. To understand it, you first need one piece of botany that most people never learn in school. Trees have sexes, not all of them, because a great many trees carry both male and female flowers on the same plant. And those trees produce their own pollen and their own seed together. But a large number of the trees lining American streets are what botanists call dioecious, which means an individual tree is either male or female and never both. Poplars and cottonwoods are like this, and so are willows, ash trees, mulberries, box elders, junipers, yews, and several other species that are extremely common in towns and suburbs. The male tree produces the pollen, releasing it into the wind in enormous clouds every spring, and that is its entire reproductive job. The female tree produces the flowers that catch that pollen, and then it produces the seed, the fruit, the berry, or the pod that follows. So a male tree gives you pollen and nothing else, while a female tree gives you fruit and no pollen at all. Hold on to that distinction, because everything that follows depends on it. Now let me show you the document, because this is the part that genuinely surprised me when I first read it. In 1949, the United States Agriculture published its Yearbook of Agriculture, which was a substantial reference volume distributed widely and taken seriously by anyone working in horticulture, landscaping, or municipal planning. Inside it, in the section on street trees, was a recommendation that reads almost innocently. It advised that when trees are used for street planting, only male trees should be selected in order to avoid the nuisance created by seed. That is the sentence. And it is not a conspiracy or a rumor, because it was printed in a federal agricultural reference and read by exactly the people who decided what would be planted outside your house. Now here's the part where I want to be fair, because the reasoning behind it was not malicious and it was not stupid. Put yourself in the position of a city planner in 1949, standing on a residential street looking at a row of female trees and fruit. Those trees drop fruit and seed pods onto the sidewalk every year, and that fruit rots on the concrete, stains it permanently, and turns slippery in the rain. It attracts flies and wasps, and it has to be swept up by municipal crews, which costs real money and labor every single autumn. Meanwhile, homeowners complain, and the sidewalks look neglected, and nobody is thanking the city for the mess outside their door. So somebody proposed an elegant solution, which was to plant only male trees. They understood perfectly well that male trees produce pollen, and they simply did not consider that a serious problem, because in 1949, allergies were not a major public health concern, and pollen was not something anybody was measuring. They traded a mess they could see for a problem they could not, and they had no reason to think the trade was a bad one. Then something happened that took that recommendation and scaled it across the entire country in a way nobody planned. Dutch elm disease. Through the middle of the 20th century, a fungal disease spread through the American elm, which at that point was the signature street tree of urban America. Elms had been planted in vast numbers because they grew fast, tolerated city conditions, and formed those beautiful arching canopies over the road that you see in old photographs of American towns. The disease killed them in staggering numbers across city after city over several decades. The loss is difficult to overstate, because tens of millions of American elms died, and entire towns watched their signature streets go bare within a few years. Streets that had been shaded tunnels of green for half a century became open corridors of bare pavement, and the change was so visible that it appears in local newspaper archives across the country as a civic tragedy. Municipalities were under enormous pressure to replace what had been lost quickly, and to replace it with something that would grow fast and not die the same way, which left thousands of American towns facing exactly the same emergency at exactly the same time, because they had lost their street canopy and they needed to replant it quickly. And when they replanted, they followed the best available guidance, which said to plant male trees. So, an enormous replanting event spread across the whole country, filled American streets with male trees on a scale that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. Cities did not just plant a few, because they planted millions over decades, and they are still standing there today. Now let me explain the mechanism, because this is the part that turns a curious historical fact into an actual explanation for your symptoms. The obvious effect is that more male trees means more pollen, and that part is straightforward. But there is a second effect that is far less obvious and arguably more important. Female flowers are pollen traps. A female flower exists specifically to capture pollen out of the air, because that is how the plant reproduces, and the structures on those flowers are shaped and often sticky precisely to catch particles drifting past. So, in a natural mixed woodland, with male and female trees standing among each other, a very large portion of the pollen released never travels far at all because the female flowers of the surrounding trees pull it out of the air. The forest filters itself. Now take away every female tree, and what you have built is a landscape that generates enormous quantities of pollen and has nothing whatsoever to catch it. The pollen stays airborne, drifts through the streets, and eventually lands in the eyes and airways of the people living there. So the male-only city is not simply a city with more pollen, because it is a city with more pollen and no filter. And those two effects compound each other. Think of it the way a plumber would think about a system, since a natural woodland is a closed loop where pollen is produced and then captured within the same space. An all-male canopy breaks that loop open. And the pollen that would have been intercepted by female flowers a few meters away instead travels down the street, into gardens, through open windows, and into the lungs of everyone on the block. You have taken a system that cleaned up after itself, and removed the half that did the cleaning. There's a third factor on top of that, and it makes everything worse. Most street trees today are not grown from seed because they are cultivars, propagated by cutting or grafting, which means they are genetic clones of one original plant. That gives cities uniformity, since every tree on the street grows to the same shape at the same rate and turns color at the same time, which looks orderly and is easy to manage. But it also means an entire street can be genetically identical male trees, releasing pollen in perfect synchrony, all on the same few days. Instead of a gradual pollen season spread across a mixed population, you get a concentrated spike, and that spike is precisely what a hay fever sufferer experiences as a bad week. Now, let me show you the evidence that cities eventually noticed the problem. In the desert Southwest, allergy rates rose so sharply that municipalities took direct action. Tucson, Arizona restricted the planting of certain high pollen trees, and Las Vegas took similar measures, and Albuquerque, New Mexico, banned the planting of male mulberry trees outright. Think about what a decision like that represents, because a city does not ban a species of tree over a minor inconvenience. Those bans exist because officials concluded that specific ornamental trees were making measurable numbers of their residents ill, and the fastest way to stop it was to prohibit planting more. Those bans are the closest thing there is to an official acknowledgement that the urban canopy itself was contributing to the problem. The person who did the most to bring this to public attention is a horticulturist named Thomas Leo Ogren, who noticed the pattern while trying to build a low-allergy garden for his wife, who suffered badly from hay fever. Looking into which plants actually produced the pollen, he found the historical recommendation and the practice that followed from it, and he gave the phenomenon a name. He called it botanical sexism, which is a deliberately provocative phrase for the practice of systematically planting male trees and excluding female ones. He also did something more practically useful, because he developed a rating system called the Ogren Plant Allergy Scale, which scores plants from 1 to 10 according to how much allergy trouble they cause. That scale is now used by landscapers and city planners who want to choose trees that will not fill the air with pollen. And it is genuinely the most useful practical output of this entire story. Now, let me be completely honest with you, because there is another side to this, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. Climate change is also a real and significant driver of what is happening to pollen. And anyone who tells you the trees explain everything is overstating the case. Warmer temperatures mean longer growing seasons, which means pollen seasons that start earlier and run later than they used to, and that lengthening has been measured across North America. Higher carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere also cause many plants to produce more pollen, which has been demonstrated experimentally. So the honest picture is that these two things are stacking on top of each other, since planting policy-loaded American cities with pollen-producing trees and no filter, and a changing climate is now making those trees produce more pollen for longer each year. And I should tell you that the term botanical sexism itself is contested, because some botanists argue the phrase overstates a complicated picture, that not every street tree is dioecious, and that the increase in allergies has multiple causes, including urban air pollution, which irritates airways and makes people react more strongly to pollen they might otherwise tolerate. That criticism is fair, and the underlying facts do not depend on the phrase. The 1949 recommendation exists, the male-only practice happened, the female trees that would have caught the pollen are largely absent from city streets, and the cities that banned specific trees did so for a reason. You can drop the provocative label and every one of those facts remains exactly where it was. So what actually helps, and what can anybody realistically do about it? The first answer belongs to cities rather than to individuals, and it is straightforward because the solution to a male-only canopy is a mixed one. Planting female trees alongside male ones restores the natural pollen filter. And yes, it also means somebody has to sweep the sidewalk again, which is precisely the trade that was made against us in 1949 and can now be made back. Planting a genuine diversity of species rather than street after street of the same clone spreads the pollen season out instead of concentrating it into a spike. And choosing low allergy species in the first place is the single most effective option, since the allergy scale exists specifically to make that choice easy for anyone doing the planting. Some cities have begun exactly this, replacing high pollen species as old trees come down and writing allergy ratings into their planting specifications. For an individual, the useful move is smaller but real, and it starts with knowing what is actually outside your window. If you have hay fever, identify the trees on your own property and on your street, because there is a genuine chance the worst offender is a specific tree you walk past every day without thinking about it. If you're planting something in your own garden, look up its allergy rating before you buy it. Because a well-chosen tree gives you shade without the pollen, and a badly chosen one is a decision you live with for 30 years. And keep in mind that some of the worst pollen producers in an American yard are not trees at all, since certain ornamental grasses and hedge plants are heavy pollen producers that people plant right up against their windows. There are also a few practical habits that make a real difference during the worst weeks, and they are worth knowing because they cost nothing. Pollen counts are generally highest in the morning, so if you exercise outdoors, moving that to the evening helps more than people expect. Keeping windows closed during peak days and rinsing your face and hair after coming inside removes pollen you would otherwise carry to your pillow and breathe all night. Drying laundry indoors during heavy pollen weeks stops your sheets from acting as a pollen filter, which is exactly what a line of washing outdoors becomes. And a wet day is genuinely a relief, since rain pulls pollen out of the air, while dry, windy days are the ones that carry it furthest and put the most of it in front of your face. Now let me put the whole thing in perspective, because there is a lesson in this that goes well beyond pollen. Nobody in 1949 was trying to make anyone ill because a group of professionals faced a genuine, visible, expensive problem in the form of rotting fruit on public sidewalks, and they solved it efficiently. The cost of that solution simply arrived somewhere else, decades later, in a form nobody was measuring at the time, and nobody connected back to the original decision. Which is what makes this story worth telling, since the trees on your street were chosen for you by people you will never meet, for reasons that made complete sense at the time. And you are still living inside that decision every spring. Let me answer the questions I know are coming. Is this really why my allergies are bad? It is a genuine and significant contributing factor in urban areas, and it sits alongside climate change and air pollution rather than replacing them. Do all trees have separate sexes? No, since many species carry both male and female flowers on the same plant, and the issue applies specifically to the dioecious species that dominate a lot of street planting. Which trees are the worst offenders? Wind-pollinated species with heavy pollen output such as male mulberry, cottonwood, ash, box elder, juniper, and cedar are consistently among the worst, and the allergy scale ranks them properly. Which trees are safest for allergy sufferers? Generally, the ones pollinated by insects rather than wind, since their pollen is heavy and sticky and designed to travel on a bee rather than a breeze, and female trees of dioecious species produce no pollen at all. Why not just remove the male trees? Because removing a mature urban canopy would be enormously destructive and expensive, and mature trees provide shade, cooling, and air quality benefits that far outweigh the pollen. So the realistic path is changing what gets planted next. Did cities really ban trees over this? Yes, since several southwestern cities restricted or prohibited planting particular high pollen species after allergy rates climbed. So here is the whole of it. American cities are full of male trees because a federal agricultural reference recommended exactly that in 1949 in order to keep fruit off the sidewalks. Dutch elm disease then destroyed the existing street canopy across thousands of towns, and the mass replanting that followed applied that recommendation on a scale nobody had imagined. Male trees produce the pollen, female trees catch it, and by planting one and excluding the other, cities built landscapes that generate enormous amounts of pollen with nothing at all to filter it. Add clonal planting that releases all of that pollen in a single synchronized spike, add a warming climate that extends the season and increases production, and you have the spring you're currently living through. Nobody hid this, since it was printed in a government yearbook and followed in the open for 50 years, and the only thing that was lost was the memory of why the trees outside your window look the way they do. So tell me down in the comments what city you are in and how bad your pollen season has been this year. And if you know what species are lining your street, name them, because I would like to see how many of us are living on a street full of male trees without knowing it. I read every single one. Next time I'm going to show you the tree that American cities planted everywhere for shade, that is now cracking sidewalks and sewer lines across the country, and that most homeowners cannot identify. Subscribe so you don't miss it. And remember that the landscape around you was designed by somebody, and every design has a cost that shows up somewhere.